Hey, greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Craig Fahle Show on Deadline Detroit. Very glad to have you with me today, and I'm very excited to have with me on the program today Mary Beth Kelly, former member of the Michigan Supreme Court, now a candidate for Wayne County Circuit Court. Mary Beth Kelly, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Craig, and it's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I was listening to an interview you did the other day on Paul W. Smith's show, and I thought it was an interesting take that you had that, because we think of the Supreme Court as being the pinnacle of the legal profession, right? But it is so much different than the kind of work that you get to do at the circuit court level. And it certainly seems as if you find more value in dealing with individual cases as opposed to sort of these loftier questions of stare decisis and things along those lines.
That's exactly it, and I think I talked a lot about that with Kevin Dietz on the Paul W. Smith show. But so a trial court, like the circuit court, the court I'm running for, and the court that I previously served on for 11 years, we really hear everyday people disputes. It's really kind of the people's court, if you will. So I'm also a visiting judge on that court right now, assigned to the family division. So we hear in the circuit court, we hear criminal cases, we hear divorce cases, we hear child protective services cases where people have been abused of maltreatment and they stand to lose the parental rights to their children, which obviously is probably the most dear right that one has. And so the way that you run a trial court really impacts people directly. And people feel that, and you feel that when you're in the courtroom. And you're right, being on the Supreme Court, and it was a great honor, and I felt like I contributed much while I was there. But it's a totally different kind of job, if you will. Dealing with appellate law, dealing with those matters that are jurisprudentially significant, if you will, to the state of Michigan, it is very, very different than trying a case as to whether one has actually abused their child or not, and should that person no longer have the rights to raise that child. That's a terribly important case. And to me, it was what I found lacking I shouldn't say lacking, I found that my people skills in dealing with the public and dealing with lawyers and actually creating, as I say, like this sense of justice that one can feel when they walk into a courtroom. And they can feel it if it's not there. And that to me is what I consider my greatest contribution to the judiciary.
Well, and I want to ask you about that because you left the Supreme Court. You went to Bodman, which is obviously a big international firm. I mean, they have a great reputation, and the private sector obviously is quite a bit more lucrative than the judiciary. That is for sure. But there must have been something lacking in that private practice that you were missing.
Well, so I was with Bodman for really just over a year when JAMS, which is Judicial Arbitration and Mediation Services, which is a global dispute resolution firm, opened its office in Detroit, Michigan. And Jerry Rosen had just stepped down as chief judge of the Eastern District Federal Court. And Steve Rhodes was the chief judge of the Bankruptcy Court. And of course, the two of them together, as you know, mastered, if you will, the grand bargain that got Detroit out of bankruptcy. So I was approached by Jerry Rosen asking if I'd be interested in joining JAMS. And the idea of mediating cases and adjudicating arbitrations, which I really enjoy doing, was something that really appealed to me. It was kind of like private judging, if you will. And so I started working at JAMS. And shortly after that, the chief judge of the Wayne County Circuit Court, Bob Colombo at the time, approached me and said, would you be interested in being a visiting judge in addition to this mediation and arbitration stuff you're doing? JAMS said that it was fine. And so I started working as a visiting judge back in January of 2018 in the circuit court, specifically in the family division, and filling in at first for judges who were out on medical leave. And then after that, there were a series of some backlog cases. Now, most cases settle no matter what division. No matter what division, the vast majority of cases settle. So, just to give you an idea, in our civil division, our last annual report is for 2018. 2019 annual report would have come out at the end of the first quarter, which we all know was when COVID hit. So we're still waiting for that statistical report. But In 2018, just to give you an idea, the civil division started with some 25,000 cases. 10,000 of those cases settled. 35 went to jury trial and 35 went to bench trial. And then some remained at the end of the year. So, a trial in a civil matter is very, very rare. Likewise, in domestic relations, the vast majority of these cases settle. And in domestic relations, it's really more difficult. A lot of people can't afford a lawyer. And, their spouse might want to get divorced. They both might want to get divorced. But the grim reality is it's really expensive to get divorced. And we know that the vast majority of those cases settle too. So, Wayne County is unique in that it's not just the largest, circuit court in the state of Michigan. And it's not just spread out among 4 different buildings, which is itself an impediment, but it's got so many pro se litigants. And so the access to justice issues become very, very important. And it becomes really important that the court offer mediation services, which we do, that the court funnel pro se litigants to legal aid chapters, because that's becoming, there's more and more federal and state dollars being spent on legal aid. And so, but the judge also plays a role in that. And the judge can treat a pro se litigant with respect and with dignity, or a judge can ride roughshod over them. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that when our citizens come to court, they deserve to be treated, whether or not they have a lawyer, with all of the respect that the judge can offer, and also with all of the resources that both the court has and that our community has.
It does seem as if we are witnessing sort of a shift in the way that the judiciary is thinking about these very things you're talking about. I mean, it was just, a couple of decades ago that every judge that was running for a position was talking about this, I'm strong and I'm a law and order kind of person, tough on crime. The reality is the stuff you're dealing with in the circuit court are things like custody cases, divorces, civil matters, and making sure people have adequate representation didn't used to be the top concern. Where did the shift occur, and is it a good thing?
The great thing. And so the shift has occurred, I would say, in about the last 10 years or so. The access to justice, as we call it, has been federally mandated. The American Bar Association mandates it. Our Supreme Court mandates it. And it involves all kinds of issues besides persons being able to afford a lawyer. But the other shift that I think you speak to, which is so important, is we've created, and this I think is an access to justice issue, so many treatment courts. And so for decades, we had the adult drug court, and nonviolent offenders whose crime was really committed because of an addiction to substances could be diverted into this adult drug court. And they would be closely monitored, they would receive services, and it was very, very successful. So successful in the sense that offenders got treatment for their addiction. They got over their addiction. You had to be clean, if you will, to graduate from drug court. But they also didn't clog up our jails with persons who really needed substance abuse treatment. Well, since that time, we've now created, and state law has actually required some of these treatment courts. We have the mental health court. We have the veterans court for those persons who have served our country, come back, and for whatever reason find themselves entangled in the criminal justice system. We have a very, very successful veterans court. We have a juvenile mental health court, which is so important for our young people because we know that a young person's brain has not fully developed. Young people don't think through the consequences of their actions. And when you couple that with some kind of mental health issue, there's no reason to treat that young person within the juvenile system itself.
We'll talk about juvenile justice in just a second, because I think that's a key issue here in the state of Michigan, obviously. But you were talking about how these diversions away from criminal courts in particular have led to obviously not clogging up the jails. Now, they have put pressure on things like friend of the court, the probationary system as well. And so you've got caseloads that may be higher than we might like. Do you get a sense that the powers that be in Lansing and in Washington are beginning to understand they need to funnel resources to those support aspects of the judicial system that don't often get the type of attention they might need?
That's a great question. There's no question that, so our friend of the court, 2018 collected some $2.7 million in, no, excuse me, $267 million in child support, just in Wayne County, just in Wayne County.
That's
And
huge.
that's huge. At friend of the court, in Wayne County, we are really strapped with the fiscal, our budget issues. So, Wayne County as a whole, obviously property taxes are not what they used to be. And so we have a really hard time at the front of the court retaining talent. We have so many open positions. So yes, we need those support, those ancillary parts of the court to really be lifted up. And that is a realization nationally. It is a realization in Lansing. I think that our present Chief Justice, Justice Bridget McCormick, is very, very committed to not to the treatment courts, to the access to justice issues, and to getting people out of incarceration that don't belong there.
Well, that brings up the question then of like issues like cash bail. There are a lot of circumstances where, you know what, you can't pay cash bail. You are basically incarcerated until your hearing, and that means you lose your job, or and no way to support your family, which just exacerbates the problem.
It really does, and now it means that you would be subject to a heightened exposure to COVID. So the cash bond and high bond and the disparity among judges on bond issues is very, very significant. I think it's very important that judges respect the recommendations of prosecutors on bail issues. Prosecutors are close to the case. They have done a lot of investigation that the judge doesn't know about yet. And so when you see a judge going way over what the prosecutor has even recommended as the bond, I think that's a real issue. And I would favor more uniformity in courts on bail issues. If you have a first-time nonviolent offender, there's no reason for a cash bond on that person. And you're right. The first question I always ask, because I actually do a lot of arraignments right now I'm doing a lot of arraignments, and the first question I ask is the defendant employed? And if the defendant is employed, by whom? How long has he been employed? I often ask, did you have to take a drug test to get that job? And the answer is usually yes. And I say, did you pass? And the answer is usually yes. And when you have someone like that, that's not a person that we want to detain. And I also think people should not be detained unless they're violent on issues like, a parole violation. We tend to detain them until they can get a hearing. Well, why don't we just tether them until they can get a hearing? So I think that the issue of bringing some parity and bringing some guidelines to bond issues is a really important subject.
I should remind folks, my guest right now is Mary Beth Kelly. She is right now a candidate for Wayne County Circuit Court. She is currently a visiting judge in the court, but she was in the court before that. She was in the Michigan Supreme Court for several years as well. Let's get to juvenile justice for just a second, because Michigan went through a period where we were, again, towing that tough on crime line. And we had young people, Nathaniel Abraham comes to mind, going to jail for life shooting somebody as an 11-year-old. There were a number of other high-profile cases in the state. What we've learned from that is that early incarceration doesn't necessarily set somebody up for success as they become an adult, even if they do get let out. And that one ended tragically, obviously.
It ended tragically, there's no question.
But I mean, it's such a huge example of it, and it almost seems to have triggered sort of a review of these policies nationwide. And that's, somebody's, I guess, has to be the guinea pig in these types of things. But what have we learned about how to treat young people in this system?
So we've had tremendous leadership from the United States Supreme Court on this issue, who has really taken seriously the issue of brain science. And they have, in their opinions, the majority has expressed, we know that teenagers' brains are not fully developed. We know that they act impulsively. We know that they act differently. We know that they don't think through the consequences of their actions. And, worst of all, sometimes just hanging around with the wrong person can get someone incarcerated as an accomplice or as a conspirator. And so the Supreme Court has actually weighed in on a number of very significant cases. One of the great joys of my legal career, honestly, and my time on the Supreme Court was having Brian Stevenson, who he's one of my legal heroes. So Brian Stevenson was just featured in the movie Just Mercy, which is the name of a book he authored, sort of an autobiography of himself. And he is well known as a Harvard-educated lawyer for taking on the cases of indigent persons on death row throughout the United States who he believes to be innocent. But he's expanded that to juvenile justice as well. And he argued the case in the Michigan Supreme Court on whether juvenile offenders who were sentenced to life without parole should be given an individualized hearing where the court gets to assess these issues, like, how old were they when they committed the crime? What kind of support system did they have at home? What kind of maturity level do they have? What's their IQ? And so again, that was one of the great delights of my legal career and my time on the Michigan Supreme Court. To my great disappointment, I could not get 4 of my colleagues to agree with me, and I wrote the dissent in a case called People versus Karp. But to my delight, 2 years later, the United States Supreme Court agreed with the reasoning, and now any individual who's in a Michigan prison because of a crime that he or she committed as a juvenile is entitled to an individualized hearing where the court has to assess whether that person should remain incarcerated. But the whole juvenile justice system itself has undergone tremendous reform, where there's so much diversion now. We're diverting young people who don't, nonviolent offenders without a record into diversion programs. We're not incarcerating truant people anymore, which seems like a silly thing to say, but we used to do that. So there's been a lot of juvenile reform, and I'm very grateful to have served on the Michigan Committee for Juvenile Justice, to actually have chaired it. And while the legislature passed the Raise the Age legislation. So of course that refers to, in Michigan, we used to treat 17-year-olds as they were adults. And it wasn't like the prosecutor chose to charge them as an adult. They were deemed an adult. And the worst part of all of that, in my mind, is that these 17-year-olds had no idea. They had no idea that if they thought it was a great idea one night to jump into a car and take it for a joyride, and they were 17 years old, and they get stopped and arrested, they're going to be charged as adults with, all kinds of crimes. I mean, that the persons in the car would be co-conspirators, they'd be aiders and abettors. And so happily, Michigan is no longer the outlier on treating 17-year-olds as adults. We now treat them as juveniles.
Well, and that seems to have given judges at the circuit court level a lot more leeway in how they approach these things. So, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about, what your personal philosophy is if somebody's coming before you, and how you're going to gauge the facts of each of these cases. They're all going to be different, obviously, but what's the sort of similar approach you take to each of these?
Right. So on the juvenile side, I'm really interested in, is this young person in school? Are they in school? Because we know that truancy leads to crime. We know that one of the best indicators of whether a young person is going to end up in the adult criminal system is whether they're involved in the juvenile system. So we don't want to treat the juvenile system as a gateway to the adult prison system. So I'm really interested in whether or not they're in school, in whether or not they have some kind of family support. So, who do you live with? And many times, they live with auntie, and they don't know where their parents are sometimes. There's no question we have a disproportional minority representation in our juvenile justice system. We have a disproportional minority representation in our adult criminal system as well. And that's something that I think that we as a court really need to address. And the Black Lives Matters movement, in my mind, has really brought that issue, that disparity issue, to a place where we as a court can say, what can we do? How can we ally with this movement? What can we gain from this movement? And I chaired a statewide study several years ago looking at that issue of racial equity. How are juveniles disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system, and why? So if the young person before me is a person of color, I'm concerned. I'm concerned because I know that they're disproportionately overrepresented. And it's, different counties take different approaches to juvenile justice because we don't have a statewide approach to it. So a young person in Berrien County, for example, might commit a crime, and they might be put in some residential treatment center. The same crime may be committed by a young person in, say, Midland County, and they're going to be given some programs that are age appropriate to that person. So I'm very interested if the young person's in school. I'm very interested in what kind of support system they have at home. I'm interested in whether or not they are able to keep rules. So, do you have a curfew? Do your parents have a curfew for you? And maybe they've never had that structure. Maybe they don't have a curfew. And so that's an important fact to me, that, they haven't been raised with structure. And so I think that, there's no question every case is different, but every young person that comes before the court, that's the only case they care about. They only care about their own case. They don't care about the others. And so I think it's really important that time and attention is really given to these cases, and that young people, to the extent that we can divert them, it's very, very important that we do. And again, there's been such progress made on this at the statewide level, and that's just reflecting what's being done nationally.
My guest once again, Mary Beth Kelly, candidate for Wayne County Circuit Court. This is a question that I have for you from a voter's perspective, because at the Supreme Court level, there's at least a guide for voters. You can see who was nominated by the Republicans, who was nominated by the Democrats, which I think personally is incredibly stupid, because judicial independence is supposed to be there. Some partisan nominations I think are a bad idea. But at the same time, at the circuit court level, you're all coming in as independents, right? So what should somebody be looking at as a voter when they're considering who to put on the bench?
So there's organizations that interview us as candidates and give us rankings. So the Detroit Bar Association has done this for decades and decades and decades, probably since before I was born, and I'm pretty old. And they give actual rankings. So you fill out a questionnaire, a very long questionnaire. You attach opinions to it. Then they interview you in a Zoom interview with many panelists, and they give you a rating. So this year, they gave Chandra Baker and myself outstanding, which is the highest rating that they have. And then the Wolverine Bar Association is another very important bar association that really champions the work of our minorities, and they've done a great job. The Wolverine Bar Association has done wonderful, wonderful things. Likewise, we got a questionnaire. They interview us all separately. And again, I got extremely well qualified, which is the highest ranking one can get. Chandra Baker got the same. The other candidates got lesser ratings. So I think looking at organizations, nonpartisan organizations that you respect, is an important way to gauge what kind of judge you are actually voting for. And that's what I would recommend to voters. All of us have websites. So I'm not going to campaign here, but my website, for example, is marybethkellyforjudge.com. The other candidates, if you just put their name in, their websites will come up. And you can look at their websites, and they'll tell you what their ratings were by these various organizations. And so I think that's a really good way for citizens to evaluate their judges.
Well, I do want to ask you a little bit about the Supreme Court, though, just because as I hinted at, this partisan system that we have here in Michigan is very odd to me, because, yes, I'm nominated by the Republicans, but I swear I'm not bringing any of that stuff with me to the bench. And I know judicial independence is something. Well, I'm sorry.
think that's probably how they felt about me.
Well,
But
but it's funny because you see these ads for candidates, and there aren't as many this year, which is interesting to me. There have not been flooding the airwaves the way they used to in years past, where but they're like, he's tough on crime, or she's doing this, but not those aren't the types of cases that you're hearing at the Supreme Court. I mean, so for voters' perspectives there, when engaging and trying to figure out who's going to be a good Supreme Court justice,
yeah.
what advice do you have for voters in terms of what they should be thinking about when they pull that lever?
So again, judicial independence, like you say, I think is the most important quality for a Supreme Court justice. And again, that's difficult to convey because a statute in Michigan requires that political parties nominate you. Now, you can gauge someone's judicial independence by who's supporting them, for example. Do they have a cross-section of support from different organizations that favor more conservative, more political? What kind of experience do they have? The Supreme Court is not a place to go and cut your teeth on being a judge. It's just not. You have to bring a level of experience with you, which I think you have to bring a level of experience to the circuit court. I don't think any judge position is one for a novice. You need an experience in the legal world that's going to allow you to bring a perspective to the cases. But I think that you can certainly evaluate Supreme Court justices on the basis of independence, on their histories, on their track record, so to speak. What have they done before they've run for the Supreme Court that would qualify them to be the final arbiter of what the law of the state of Michigan should be? And that's really what the question is.
Well, one last question for you. I've kept you for quite a while already, and I appreciate the time you've been willing to give me today. For all the things we've been talking about today, and we are sensing a real shift in the way that sort of the legal system is looking at just about everything. There's lots of conversations about systemic racism in this country, and how difficult is it going to be to sort of unpack that from the judicial system here in Wayne County and, frankly, statewide and nationwide?
So there's no question. That is a great question. And racial inequities is something that, again, has plagued the Wayne County Circuit Court. Back when I was the chief judge of the court in 2005, I made it the mission to really, really seriously approach this issue of a lack of diversity in the Wayne County jury pool. And I brought in the National Center for State Courts, and they conducted a 2-year study and came up with recommendations. We now still have a committee on the Wayne County Circuit Court to increase the participation of minority jurors. So it's a problem that, as you say, is systemic. But there are certainly ways that, again, being mindful of a young person who comes before you. If that person is of color, they have a very, very different background, and they might not have the support. They may be a very affluent African American. I'm certainly not suggesting that there are not those, because there are. But I think that in addressing the systemic racism, we need to come together. We need to ally with those persons who can really, really champion those issues. And again, we have, I think, a very diverse bench, which I think speaks well to the citizens of Wayne County. It speaks well to the citizens of Wayne County to know that the court consists of a huge cross-section of all ethnicities. And I think that that's very, very important. But we have to look for those opportunities, like I say, to really partner with those community outreach programs that are there and say, what can they bring to the court? How can they help us? And so we need help. We need persons to do pro bono work. We need legal aid societies. We need public defenders. And to the extent that we can help mentor young people into the legal profession, into the judiciary, we should be doing that.
All right. Well, Justice Kelly, we certainly appreciate your time today. We will anxiously await the results of the election coming up in just a few weeks, but we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Craig.
My name's M.L. Elric. I'm an investigative reporter and a connoisseur of fine yogurts. I know a little bit about Detroit. I know a little bit about deadlines, and I'm asking you to become a member of DeadlineDetroit.com. Like me, I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do. I'm making a monthly donation. My wife is making a monthly donation. I know that seems redundant, but they need the money, and the money goes to a good place. Getting the story out, getting the truth out. Because if we don't support local journalism, there's some people a couple blocks away from here who are going to get away with a whole bunch of stuff that's going to cost you a whole lot more than just a few bucks out of your pocket every month. Go to deadlinedetroit.com, become a member. You'll see it's really easy at the top of the website. Give early, give often, give generously. Just give a damn. That's the best way I know how.